For the better part of 100 years, the country we know today as Vietnam had been a French colony, as with the two other countries in Indochina, Laos and Cambodia. And during World War II, as France itself was occupied by the Nazis, they lost their colonial control over their worldwide colonies, especially in Indochina, most specifically in Vietnam. Japan occupied Vietnam during World War II, and they were quite brutal unto the Vietnamese public. And then once the war ended, the French attempted to regain colonial control over Indochina. And they were challenged by Vietnamese nationals who referred to themselves as the Viet Minh, led by a revolutionary named Ho Chi Minh, who had spent time in Paris studying French, was actually influenced by the United States Declaration of Independence. He was committed to Vietnamese nationalism. He was committed to the idea of doing away with the exploitation of imperialists and colonists. There began an independence movement in Vietnam to oust the French from their country. They wanted autonomy and independence. Ho Chi Minh had become influenced in Marxist ideology, anti colonial, anti imperial ideology, and a sense of nationalism. And shortly after the French regained control of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh would declare a revolution in Vietnam that would take about 30 years to eventually realize. Okay? A lot of things would happen in between that time. Otherwise, though, he would try and set up a nationalist government in Hanoi, in North Vietnam. Over the course of the next numbers of years, the Viet Minh would engage French Foreign Legion forces so as to gain their actual and physical independence. And long story short, Ho Chi Minh actually approached the United States for help. Even though he was a Marxist sympathizer, he still valued the United States. As I mentioned earlier, he had studied the American Declaration of Independence, was actually heavily influenced by America. He didn't hate America at all. He was actually influenced by us. He actually approached our government and asked for support in actually helping remove the French. The French are our allies. We owe our independence to the French, and we fought in two major world wars on the side of the French. They're one of our closest allies. We can't really ask that of them. So we basically tell Ho Chi Minh, thanks, but no thanks. Hold that thought, because I mentioned that Ho Chi Minh was influenced by Marxist ideology. Hold that thought. Otherwise, though, as the Viet Minh begins their independence movement through military action, French forces are now attracted more towards Indochina to confront the Viet Minh. Things come to a head in a small town in modern day northern Vietnam, tucked away near mountains. Was the town of Dien Bien Phu. And at Dien Bien Phu, Vietnamese forces surrounded a French military outpost and engaged French forces and overtook them, killing hundreds upon hundreds of French Foreign Legion soldiers and taking the rest of them captive. That forced the French hand. The Vietnamese were going to have their independence. And as a result of the French ouster, things had to be negotiated. At the Geneva Convention, Shortly thereafter, in 1954, it was decided that, temporarily at least, the country we know as Vietnam would be separated into halves. Very similarly to Korea, by the way. Korea was separated between the northern and southern countries at the 38th parallel. We know those two countries today as North and South Korea. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel. You would have North Vietnam that would be backed and supported by the Soviets and the Chinese, and South Vietnam would be supported by the United States. It was agreed upon as part of the Geneva Conference that in 2 years, in 1956, the country would be able to vote for its remerging, if you will, so they could unify the country. Couple different problems if you are on the side of the United States. One, North Vietnam had become influenced by the Soviets. We told Ho Chi Minh, thanks but no thanks. So he looked for help in Moscow, and he found it. Secondarily, North Vietnam at the time had a larger population than did South Vietnam. And if you do a demographic study of Vietnamese culture at that time, even though North Vietnam was more populous, you had more poor pockets in North Vietnam than you did in South Vietnam. South Vietnam at the time was more heavily influenced by French Catholicism. You had a little bit more of an aristocracy in South Vietnamese cities. You had more of a laissez-faire type mindset that kept people separate. South Vietnam was also a little bit more fertile. So especially in the Mekong River Delta, you have an immense amount of agricultural output, specifically rice, from South Vietnam. You have different factions, you have different mindsets, you have Catholics, you have Buddhists, you have wealthy, you have poor villagers, you have the cities, you have the small towns, you have the itty-bitty little hamlets, you have ethnic differences, Cambodian influence. South Vietnam is not together. North Vietnam is slightly different from a climatological standpoint. Not drastically different, but it's a little bit different. You don't have quite the output in North Vietnam that you do in South Vietnam. And because you have less fragmentation in North Vietnam, you have a better opportunity for there to be more of a sympathetic mindset to ideology of unification. Enter Ho Chi Minh, who, again, was a Marxist sympathizer who became a full-fledged supporter of Marxist unification of Vietnam. And in 1956, the country was supposed to vote to unify. Because the North had more people, invariably, they would win an election. And because the South was fragmented in the first place, they were going to lose an election. So the United States actually supported an election resistance. And they supported Nguyen Diem, basically the South Vietnamese dictator at the time, who openly resisted this election. No, let's keep our two Vietnams as they should be. Little thing about Nguyen Diem. He was implemented as a leader of South Vietnam in 1956. He would violently suppress various different religious sects, like the Buddhists, for example. They potentially threatened his authority in South Vietnam. He wanted to basically eliminate any naysayers of the South Vietnamese government, of which there were many. He was somewhat of a brutal dictator. He was also pro-United States. Or at least he wasn't anti-United States, and he wasn't a communist. Okay. So we've got a problem in South Vietnam. In the meantime, North Vietnam wants to unify the country, and they have some influence with small pockets of the segment in South Vietnam. So much so that an entire political movement that is funded and sponsored by the North Vietnamese is activated in South Vietnam to engage South Vietnamese communists and communist sympathizers into a political and even a guerrilla military unit. The political movement I'm discussing was called the National Liberation Front, the NLF. The military arm of the National Liberation Front would become a guerrilla force that would threaten the South Vietnamese government and engage South Vietnamese military forces militarily all throughout the countryside. We know the military arm of the National Liberation Front as the Viet Cong, the VC. Viet Cong comes from the term Vietnamese Communist Guerrilla, Viet Cong, VC for short. And if you've ever done studies of Vietnamese war movie history or anything like that, Charlie, the Army and Marines are going to go out looking for Charlie. That basically is a nickname for going out to look for the VC. Okay. The National Liberation Front gains a foothold all throughout the countryside, partially because Diem is a brutal dictator who's suppressing his own people. So yes, he's an ally of the United States, but he's pretty brutal. And by the early 1960s, the Viet Cong had destabilized quite a number of aspects of the South Vietnamese government. They had secretly killed up around 4,000 South Vietnamese government agents, and their influence pervaded the countryside all over South Vietnam. And the South Vietnamese army was not very well organized at that time. So the United States sees all of these things going on in South Vietnam. They see this communist influence uprising in South Vietnam. They see all sorts of demonstrations against the Diem regime there in South Vietnam, including Buddhist monks in 1963 who, as a matter of protest against the brutality, douse themselves with gasoline and then light themselves on fire on live TV. I still don't understand that one. But otherwise, though, it was apparent that the Diem regime and all the resistance to him, and not just the VC, by the way, it became painfully obvious that things were not going to stand guard with him. So the United States backed a coup attempt by South Vietnamese military leaders to oust Diem and his brother from his dictatorship. And they do in 1963. About 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, JFK himself is assassinated. Oops. Okay. What shortly followed was a South Vietnamese government history that was actually even less organized than the Diem regime. You create a power vacuum where now all sorts of people are struggling for power. That makes things even worse. In the meantime, you're now going to have the Viet Cong gain an even stronger footprint because the South Vietnamese government is not organized. And the North Vietnamese are, as are South Vietnamese communists in the NLF. The United States senses an issue here because obviously we want to contain communism. Obviously we want to keep Vietnam from going by the way of communists, and we want to keep the two Vietnams separate. The South Vietnamese military is struggling. The central leadership in South Vietnam is struggling. The Eisenhower administration had identified many of these issues by the late 1950s and had sent over various different military advisories and other funds to help support the South Vietnamese cause. JFK, as he was still president, began an advisory type situation to where the United States military would send over military advisors, not actual troops that are designed for war, but advisors that can be attached to South Vietnamese military units so as to help train them and perhaps advise them about engaging in anti-guerrilla tactics to confront the Viet Cong. Upwards of around 16,000 advisors were in Vietnam by 1963. Okay, we're not at full-scale war. We're not sending our entire army and Marines, and we're not sending all that kind of stuff yet. But we're sending a message that, hey, we're not engaging in war, but we're at least trying to help our friends. Okay? So we have an investment in the containment of communism in South Vietnam. By this time, we're putting specific American advisors, of which I've actually met several. I interviewed a Vietnam vet about 5 years ago who in 1962 was attached to a South Vietnamese army unit. He was an advisor, and they would discover tactics of the Viet Cong and engage them in ways to maybe help contain them. He would be the only American in a unit. He was their advisor, and he would often try to disengage himself from any sort of confrontations. But otherwise, though, he's an example of an American who was there trying to influence and aid the South Vietnamese military. So things would eventually come to a head. With the assassination of JFK, many different things would have to happen. Lyndon Johnson was also a staunch anti-communist. And something was going to come to a head in Vietnam because the Viet Cong was gaining influence. The North Vietnamese were being further and further advised and influenced by the Soviets and Chinese. Something was going to happen in order to contain communism in Southeast Asia. Things come to a head in August of 1964 when some North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam in international waters approach a U.S. destroyer, a naval destroyer. And there is an engagement between the destroyer and the North Vietnamese torpedo boats. That was deemed as an act of aggression in international waters by the Johnson administration. And a few days later, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as a response to North Vietnamese aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution gave the president authority to take measures to protect American interests abroad. And if there is further aggression in Southeast Asia, LBJ would now have the authority to do something directly about it. Okay. Now we move forward.